Past perfect continuous tense. Andy was out of breath when she arrived at the class because she had been running. He had been doing this since last 3 years. He had been making noises for 10 minutes. Edmund and Molly had been looking for a country to live after their wedding when they were married. Had Raj and Sandra been studying to learn French very well in order to live and work in France? Had she been cooking any meal when he came to my home? Had you been studying French all day? Had the actress been working since morning? Had the teacher been showing them a video when the phone rang? Had Emily been listening to her songs until she realized that her songs need to improve? Had employees been achieving the target before the client came? Had she been cooking any meal when she came to my home? Had she been reading a book? Her dog had been barking at the mailman for 5 minutes before he finally left. They had been working for hours when they finally stopped for the night. Had his daughter been eating anything all day? Had I been playing game before they came to house? Had he been talking to us since for 3 days? He had been writing for hours when he eventually fell asleep. We had been working on the project for weeks before we realized we were going in the wrong direction. Had he been waiting for me in the lobby? Had he been working all day? Had they been playing tennis for a week? They had been planning the trip for months before they finally left on their journey. We had been studying English for years before we finally took our first trip to USA. Had you been cleaning the kitchen before they came? Had you been finishing your homework before you went to the store with my family? Had they been skating when they were younger? Had you been studying science all day? We had been looking for a new house for months before we finally found one. We had been studying for the test for weeks but still failed. Had you been studying French before you moved to France? Had you been drinking anything before you left? She had been jogging for miles before he reached his destination. We had been arguing for hours before they agreed. She had not been coming when you came. He had not been reading a book. He had been taking dance classes for months before he finally performed in his first recital. She had been playing the guitar for years before she finally gave her first public performance. Kent was out of breath when he came in. I had been looking for her ring for 3 days. You had not been sleeping in your room since 2 hours ago. We had been playing tennis on the tennis court for 3 hours. I had been sleeping for 2 hours when my alarm went off. I had been studying Hindi before I moved to India. They had been staying in the USA for years before they moved to the UK. He had been working at the company for years before he finally got promoted. I had been waiting for 30 minutes when the train finally arrived. I had been washing the plates before they came. We had been walking for miles before we finally reached our destination. They had been waiting for hours before they finally saw the doctor. I had not been cooking any meal when he came to my home. I had not been playing game before they came to house. Had I been holding your hand for 20 minutes? You had been sleeping in your room for 2 hours. She had not been studying when you asked. I had not been swimming since last month. I had been saving money for months before I bought my first Jeep. He had been looking for a new job for months before he found one. I had not been going to the different restaurant until it was closed forever. I was not finished my homework before I had been going to the market with my father. She had been trying to give up bad habits for years before she succeeded. We had been planning our wedding for months before we set a date. Ranjan had not been studying well until he got bad grades. It had been raining for hours and the streets were very wet. I had been working on the project for weeks before I completed it. We had been studying for my exams for weeks before we took them. It had not been raining since last fall. Jackson had been playing the piano and singing songs for 5 years when Jackson joined the competition and he won. He had been trying to wait for the train before they came. She had been mowing the lawn for an hour when she suddenly ran out of gas. Joanna had been walking 2 miles a day before she broke her leg. My cousin went to bed after he had been watching his favorite TV series. He had been eating healthily and exercising for months before he lost weight. She had been training for the marathon for months before she ran it. Roland had been working out at the gym every day before he had surgery because of his health problems. He had been cleaning the house before he fell asleep. He had been sounding very weird. He had been taking driving lessons for months before he got his driver's license. They had been working on the puzzle for days before they finally finished it. He had not been talking to us since for 3 days. He had not been working all day, so he was energetic. Sandra had been studying at the University of India when she got high grades. We had been arguing about what to watch on TV for half an hour before we finally agreed on a movie. He had been trying on dresses for hours before he finally found the perfect one. The employees had been achieving the target before the client came. The ground was covered with snow. It had been snowing heavy for several days. She had been cooking in the kitchen since she got married. She had been shopping in that market before she came home. The machine had been being installed by them. The meeting had not been ended until the MD interrupted the meeting. They had been being friends since childhood. She had been finding a solution to the problem before she got it. We had been talking about different topics for 2 hours. They had not been playing netball for a month. Thompson had been trying to repair the phone the whole day. She had been reading her favorite book since morning. They had been playing tennis in the field before I came. We had been looking in the garden for 2 hours. We had been serving him for 3 days. We had not been feeling well because all we had COVID. They had been playing tennis in that playground since 3 hours ago. They had been studying in the reading room before they came to the class. When her husband came home, the woman had been cleaning the house for hours. Where had Jacob been going to? I had been studying when they asked. They had been playing cricket on the ground for 3 hours. They had been studying in the library before they came to the class. You had not been dancing the whole month. You had not been studying science all day. I hadn't been waiting long when a bus drew up beside me. She had not been coming when you came. Mr. Jackson had been teaching in the school for 2 years. We had been knowing the bitter truth before we signed it. They hadn't been playing football. My cat hadn't been sleeping well before he died. You had been sleeping in your room since 4 hours ago. We had been running in the field when we saw the lion. I had not been studying when you asked. Had her son been eating anything all day? My father had been making the decision before I passed the exam. We had not been playing with you before we met you. They had been being friends since childhood. I knew that he had been riding the horse for many days. We had been developing this page since the last 3 weeks. She had been taking selfies for 3 hours. They had been playing tennis. She had not been studying for a few days. You had been walking all afternoon on the beach. Had you been studying math since 2 o'clock? We had been studying since last 5 years. They had been doing that business for 8 months. They had been driving the car for 1 hour. Had we been waiting for Sarah for 30 minutes before she called us? Jason had been baking a cake. They hadn't been speaking to each other for months. You had been cheating on me since last 3 days. Emma had been making the clothes for months. I hadn't been feeling well, so I sent her away. I had been watching a movie when she arrived. The politicians had been befooling us for ages. I had been suffering from illness since this evening. The ground was covered with snow. It had been snowing heavy for several days. She had been studying all day, so she tired. He had been raising the funds in the name of the cause since last week. They had been watching sacred games for 12 hours. Hannah had been listening to the same music for 3 hours when I came back home. Dixit had been watching TV for hours before he slept. Had his daughter been eating anything all day? It had been neighing since morning. I had been laughing for an hour. Had he been working all day? Had she been reading a book?